All right, so I'm now here with Will Sommer. He is a politics reporter for the Daily Beast, also the co-host of the podcast Fever Dreams, and he is currently working on a book on QAnon titled Trust the Plan. Will, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So, obviously, as I just mentioned, you report on QAnon and other elements of the right, among other things. And I really wanted to have you on today to kind of, I guess, take stock of the Republican Party and the right in general as we're kind of leading up to midterms, and specifically the ongoing influence, or perhaps lack thereof, of kind of these conspiracy theory elements on the right. So, obviously, we are in the midst of an ongoing congressional hearing on the January 6th Capitol riot. And I want to start there because if I recall, you were actually on the ground reporting from the Capitol riot in 2020. And I believe you had sort of reported on some of the elements, some of the, QAnon and other conspiracy theory elements that were present there. Now, it's sort of my impression that, there's been a bit of a kind of legal and social crackdown on some of those elements since 2020, right? So I guess the first question for you is, like, what is the state of QAnon and some of these other fringe extremist groups since 2020?
Yeah, so I think, for those of us outside of these movements, I think the state of things is pretty grim looking. I think the right is really united with whether it's more moderate Republicans, people who kind of see themselves mainly as Trump supporters, and then these fringier elements, if we think about militias, white supremacist groups, and QAnon. And of course, there's a lot of overlap between all those groups. I think right now they're all really united around winning in the midterms and getting Trump back in office in 2024. In the case of QAnon, Q, the sort of anonymous figure behind QAnon, hasn't posted since December 2020. So on one hand, you might think, well, that sounds like QAnon's over. But I think there's a lot of evidence that QAnon in many ways is stronger than ever. And that for a long time, they were laying the groundwork for sort of a QAnon without Q. So for a while, he was putting these clues out and they would say, oh, we're learning about, the way the world really is. We're learning that, Hillary Clinton needs children and all this kind of stuff. But then when Q disappeared, these ideas people had learned from Q kept going. And so they still continue to believe in them. And so now, last year I went to these QAnon conventions where people were paying thousands of dollars to attend, hundreds of people, something that had never happened before that point. I think QAnon's kind of conspiracy theory thinking has also really been mainstreamed within the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of reasons that Republicans have said the election was stolen, but I think QAnon helped kind of gain acceptance for that idea of just saying like, I can kind of choose my own reality, whatever I want. Furthermore, I think members of Congress, obviously Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, have been supporters of QAnon, and we're slated to get at least one more in Congress, a gentleman from Ohio. So, QAnon, essentially, I think I would sum it up as saying that QAnon has become a faction within the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. For a few years, there was this real question about, is the Republican Party going to banish QAnon, whatever. And then in 2020, we saw Trump essentially say that they were right for many, for a lot of the things they held. So I think it's found a home in the Republican Party.
Yeah, I want to stay on that question for a second because I think what's interesting about, groups like QAnon and then other far-right groups like the Proud Boys is obviously on the one hand, I think they often express sort of hostility or skepticism toward like the mainstream GOP. But at the same time, as you just noted, like they have made influence in some way. So maybe talk a little bit more about how these groups have managed to make inroads into the party since 2020. And, obviously this year, just in the primaries, we've seen kind of a handful of election deniers and, Capitol riot participants and, various conspiracists who have run for office in some way, right? So to what extent do these groups continue to influence the Republican Party? And where do you see them like most poised to take power this year?
Sure. I mean, I think when we talk about far-right groups, I think they're making a lot of inroads in the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. I think going back to maybe the late days of the George W. Bush administration or the Obama administration, the story of the Republican Party has consistently been a failure of the party elites to say no to the party's fringes. And right. So the party keeps moving further and further right. They have no real power. And many, sometimes they'll hold on to a primary, but, since the Tea Party, for example, they have no power to say, no, that person is too fringe. And often You think of other gatekeepers like potentially Fox News, when they have tried to push people off, like when Fox News was more skeptical of Trump in 2016, a new outlet like Breitbart springs up. And so essentially the party has no mechanism, no immune system to keep these people out. And oftentimes I don't think the politicians really care to, because they represent votes and they represent this grassroots energy. So I think these people are making tons of inroads, especially at the local level. The New York Times had a story recently about Proud Boys essentially taking over the Miami Republican Party, which is a very prominent local party in the GOP. In the case of QAnon, so many of these grassroots activists doing things like taking over school boards because they're angry about so-called groomer teachers, or they're angry about mask laws. You kind of scratch the surface, and these are pretty hardcore QAnon believers. So I think in 2022, I think we're going to see some more QAnon believers make it to Congress. But I think the most important thing is going to be at these local levels, where Michael Flynn, who's a former general, huge QAnon hero, after 2020, he and I think a lot of other QAnon supporters decided, well, there isn't going to be this sort of climactic fascist moment that Q told us about, that they're not going to send Barack Obama and John Podesta to Guantanamo Bay in this kind of big purge. So we sort of need to take action ourselves. And for some QAnon believers, that meant violence, whether on January 6th or in these kind of lone wolf incidents. But for Flynn, he said local action has a national impact is his slogan. And so that means encouraging QAnon believers to run for their school boards, to run for a local office. And the other thing I would say is really they are really advancing on the local level in terms of election control. There are a lot of county clerks who have power over elections who have been tied to QAnon. There's an entire slate of Secretary of State candidates in battleground states that were put together by a major QAnon figure. And so these sound like almost crazy ideas, like surely this wouldn't really happen. But then you look at what they're saying, and you look at the fact that it's likely to be a very heavily Republican year, and you realize that there could be a QAnon supporter in charge of elections in Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about that next, because, when we think about midterms, like, I think the way things are going for the Democrats right now, like, it kind of seems likely that the Republicans will just end up winning quite a few races fair and square. But obviously, election denial was a big thing that came out of 2020. And you had started to touch on this a little bit. How likely do you think it is that we will see, sort of renewed efforts to subvert or challenge election results this year?
I think it's hugely likely, both in 2022 and 2024. I mean, when you listen to and these are not just QAnon people, but you listen to what people like Sidney Powell, people who were in meetings with Trump, what they're saying. These are sometimes people who believe that California was stolen from Trump. I mean, these people they're not in reality. They're like on another planet. I mean, it's just for many of these people, I mean, at the fundamental level, it is the idea that Democratic votes and Democratic power, and then, what that represents, which is often, women voters, minorities, et cetera, that this is illegitimate for their candidates to win. And so for these people, the idea that a Democrat could win anything like a contested race is just impossible to fathom. And so they have to assume that there was all this kind of shenanigans behind it. So, and I think especially after 2020, for the average Republican politician, I think there's a lot more pressure to announce these kind of phony investigations like the Arizona audit if you just want to survive a primary. So I think in 2022 and 2024, I think there's a very good chance that we'll see, maybe a Senate race, something like that, just become really, really hotly contested as Republicans kind of scramble for proof that it was stolen. And ultimately, I think it's less about finding the proof that it was stolen and more about sort of casting doubt on it and saying, well, maybe we'll just have to decide it in our state legislature, which, by the way, is controlled by Republicans.
Right, conveniently. So just in terms of looking at kind of the state of the Republican Party on the eve of midterms, you've been alluding to these kind of fringe elements that exert influence here and there and how they kind of drag the party over to the right. Would you say that that is a sign that Trump continues to hold sway over the party? Or do you think that this is sort of part of a new tendency that's guiding the GOP?
That's a great question. I mean, I think there's a lot of factors at play here. I think on one hand, there is this idea that especially for these grassroots activists, Trump is kind of the end all be all. They may like Ron DeSantis, but they look at him and say, well, he's younger than Trump. We could elect him in 2028, 2032, whatever. And they see Trump as this kind of very heroic figure, often who brought them into politics in the first place. These are kind of like marginalized people who are not always normally, showing up at precinct committees in like 2004. And so for these people, I think a lot of it is Trump and the way that their identities are built up in Trump, and this idea that they kind of have to protect both his and their own egos by insisting the election was stolen and that he didn't lose it legitimately. But on the other hand, I think it goes beyond that. I mean, I think that there is this for a lot of people, there's this kind of like really reflexive skepticism and cynicism about the world. I think often, with pretty good founding. And it just makes them really like suspicious of everything and very kind of just sort of fed up with the state of the world. And I think they're looking to sort of shake things up. And often that amounts to, maybe they join the Proud Boys. Maybe they just become, very committed to, rooting out election fraud, supposedly. The Washington Post had a great profile last week of a woman who's a very prominent grassroots activist in Georgia who was holding these events for David Perdue, the Trump Senate candidate. And yet, in her meantime, she's diving into dumpsters outside election boards looking for shredded materials. I mean, so these are really these kind of really fringe, almost like deranged forces have like always existed in politics, but I think it's very rare that they've been really welcomed into the core of a party in this way.
Yeah, so maybe to go back to the January 6th hearings, which of course are still ongoing. I think that there's a lot of hope on the part of some Democrats that these hearings will kind of like rile up their own base, right? Rile up the Democratic base, get people out to vote, sort of shock people into, really sort of thinking like we can't let the Republicans back into power. Now, that said, from my perspective, it sort of seems like the things that have dominated kind of public consciousness and public opinion polls over this year are things like inflation and gas prices, right? So I guess I personally am maybe a little skeptical that the January 6th hearings are going to like shock people into coming out to vote. I think I saw that, something like 20 million people watched the first night of the hearings, which seems like a lot, but, that kind of pales in comparison to the, 73 plus million people who watched the first Donald Trump versus Joe Biden debate, right? So it's kind of hard to say. At least for me. So I'm wondering, do you think that the January 6th hearings will have any effect on the upcoming midterm elections, whether that's to kind of whip the Democratic base or the Republican base?
It's a great question. I think, I'm not an election forecaster or anything.
Yeah.
And I think Democrats would say they have other arguments for it, which is almost like they have a duty to do this. And to some extent, I do think, it's not good for Republicans. I wouldn't say. And for me, I think the evidence of that is how just absolutely apoplectic Republicans are about it, and saying that there's been all these efforts to say, oh, it's so boring, don't watch it, don't watch, really trying to downplay it. On the other hand, if you go to the supermarket and you can't buy milk, it's not the QAnon shaman standing there preventing you from doing it. It's inflation. Right. And so, I think just practically, I think inflation and the slowing down of the economy and several other things, I think are really weighing on people a lot more than that. On the, although I think you could certainly imagine, maybe some kind of, I think maybe kind of the hardcore, what we think of as kind of like the hashtag resistance voter, perhaps getting a little revved up. It's been a while, I think, since Biden has had a win, and if this counts as a win for him, I think it's the first one he's had in a while.
Yeah. So, when it comes to fighting kind of conspiracism and extremism in the U.S., is there anything we can do about these far right groups? Because and what I'm getting at is, the Biden administration like kind of made a big show of creating this short-lived like disinformation governance board. We all know that social media companies have been pretty aggressive in their efforts to kind of tamp down misinformation and crack down on hate speech. And I'm just wondering if you think that those efforts make a big difference, or what is the best way of kind of fighting this tide of disinformation and especially these fringe and often violent and dangerous groups in the U.S.?
Sure. I'm glad you mentioned the disinformation board. What a disaster. And I think that sort of sums up this like half-hearted approach to it, where I think, every so often maybe someone goes to a TED Talk or something and they're like, we should do something about disinformation. And they do this kind of botched effort. Look, I think it is, I think it would be wrong to say that what people see on Facebook and what they see elsewhere doesn't affect them in some way. I think often these things are packaged very compellingly. And just anecdotally, I've talked to people who have lost family members to, obviously a lot of people have lost family members to QAnon, or I think there's just very little information literacy in the country. On the other hand, I think it's far more interesting and I think solvable from a policy perspective. Maybe if Democrats ever could do something in the Senate, but solvable in terms of the material causes that drive people to these things. I mean,
yeah,
it's especially when you look at the cases of the people who died on January 6th, stuff like that. These are people who were really in grimy, very dire situations in their own lives, and I think that's what led them to QAnon and to these other kind of things that you can project your problems onto and say, in the case of QAnon, well, it's not that I'm this loser, or I'm a bad mother, that's why I lost custody of my kids, or something like that. I'm thinking of a specific case about these women who lose custody of their children and then become convinced that their children are being smuggled to Comet Ping Pong. But these ideas, I think they offer people these outlets. For me, ultimately, I think the best cure for these kind of movements would be a broader social welfare state that kind of gets people out of these dire situations where, they're alone all day, reading the internet, and just really depressed about their lives. But obviously, I think it's a lot easier, at least to look like you're taking action if you're like, we're gonna bug Facebook to take down these ads.
Yeah. Well, that brings up another question, which is, do you have a sense of kind of the, class background, I guess, of the people who kind of get drawn into these conspiracist or fringe elements? Because something that you just alluded to, which is that many of these people are experiencing, financial difficulties, or, feel that their life is kind of going downhill in some way, I think is really interesting. And of course, that's not to excuse any kind of, violent or extremist beliefs that they might espouse. But do you have a general sense of what it is that I don't know what kinds of positions these people are in?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, the idea of who gets into these conspiracy theories, and in particular who breaks the law for them, and
Right.
really kind of puts their lives on the line at that level. There's all these kind of studies about who, often it's people who feel very marginalized and disrespected, not always with justification.
Right.
Sometimes it's people who are just deep into conservative media. One could think of a, kind of a young white man who's being told, white men have been, they're out in today's society, and that's why, you didn't get into college you wanted. And you can imagine those gears turning. But then, sometimes they are people in desperate situations. I think of, I went to this QAnon rally in 2018, and this guy was saying, I've got cancer, but I don't have insurance to get the treatment. But the good news is that I know this kind of nefarious George Soros cabal is holding back on the treatment, and soon Trump's going to arrest George Soros, and they'll have to release the cancer treatment.
Right.
And so it's these kind of heartbreaking stories to hear, and also just how deluded someone can be. I mean, I think in the case of January 6th, we're talking not just, these are not really necessarily the salt of the earth rabble. Often
Right.
these are, kind of middle class, upper middle class people who are just completely red pilled on conservative media. I mean, it's a very it's not a typical example, but you can think of the people who flew to DC in a private jet
Right.
to go to the riot, and so I think it draws in a lot of people. I think that resentment, whether legitimate or not, I think is often a really core to it.
Yeah. All right. Well, maybe just to wrap up, a final question for you is, because, we are in the midst of the ongoing January 6th hearings, is there anything that's come up, at least in the, first round of hearings, that was surprising to you, or that, kind of made you do a double take?
Yeah, I mean, what it's been remarkable watching all the footage. I was there when before the Proud Boys attacked. I noticed them out of their uniforms, and I was like, "Oh, the Proud Boys are here," and they're shouting about attacking the Capitol. Probably not going to end great, but obviously, I did not expect it to go as far as it did. I think for me, kind of a random thing that popped up. We had a story about this on the Daily Beast. Is that Sean Hannity proposed pardoning Hunter Biden to smooth things over after January 6th, as though a very kind of weird, almost like a dynastic understanding of American politics, which obviously has some dynasties in it, but kind of this idea that congressional Democrats would be like, oh, it's okay, you tried to kill us, Hunter, you're dropping a gun charge against Hunter or something like that. Just really really remarkable, I guess.
Yeah. All right. Well, Will, thank you so much. Will Sommer, again, is a politics reporter over at the Daily Beast and co-host of the podcast Fever Dreams. Will, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.